Good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are. On behalf of SR Fatehpuria College, I welcome you for the final day session of our 3-day international webinar entitled Gender, Sexuality and Postcolonial Literature, Trends, Issues and Perspectives, organized by the Department of English in collaboration with the IQAC of the college. Today, we have 3 lectures. Dr. Gillian Dule from Australia, Professor Chandra Chakraborty from West Bengal State University, and Dr. Munia Bhaumik from Emory University, USA, will give their lectures. Without taking more time, I would like to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Gillian Dule. Before I hand over the mic to her, I would like to introduce her briefly. Dr. Gillian Dule is an honorary senior research fellow in English at Flinders University, Adelaide, South Australia. She has published extensively on Jane Austen, V.S. Naipaul, and a range of other novelists. Her books include V.S. Naipaul, Man and Writer, that was published in 2006, J.M. Corgi and the Power of Narrative, that was published in 2010, and the first web exploring early coastal contact in Australia, that was published in 2019. She was the founding general editor of the electronic journal Transnational Literature from 2008 to 2018 and is co-editor of Writers in Conversation. She has also edited several special issues of other journals, most recently revisiting Tagore critical essays on Ghore Baire in Gitanjali and Beyond in 2020. The title of her today's talk is To Every 100 Men, 40 Women, Traces of the Female Indentured Labour Experience in Nepal and Nandan. And now I would like to request her to begin her lecture. It's to you, ma'am. Thank you. You can begin the lecture now.
Ma'am, please unmute.
Yes, you need to unmute your mic, ma'am. Ma'am, you are not audible. Just unmute your mic. It shows that your mic is muted. Julie, ma'am, your mic is muted. Kindly unmute the mic unless we... Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we go. Sorry, it wasn't working.
Okay.
Now, I do present now. My entire screen. Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are absolutely audible.
Good afternoon or good evening from Adelaide, South Australia. I'm very, very happy to be here, and I would like to thank the organisers and Baksar in particular for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be among this very august group of presenters. Thank you. As we do in Australia, I would like to acknowledge that I am presenting this paper on the land of the Kaurna people, the indigenous people of this land, who have never ceded sovereignty of this land to the Europeans. And I would also like to thank very much the other presenters. I've very much enjoyed the 2 sessions of the last 2 days so far, and I've learnt a lot. Thank you very much. So my talk is about the indentured labour Indian indentured labourers from India, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to share my PowerPoint screen. How do I do that? Does anyone know how I can?
Ma'am, you already shared it, but open open your PPT. Actually, it's minimized. It's visible, ma'am.
You can see that? Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Now, for every 100 men, 40 women, traces of the female indentured labour experience in Naipaul and Nandan. The slave trade was officially abolished throughout the British Empire in 1807, the slave trade, and slavery itself abolished in 1834. However, after the abolition of slavery, there was a labour shortage throughout the empire. So immediately the British government made a deal with the Indian government, I believe, to introduce a system of indentured labour. So the indentured labourers were recruited to work on the sugar, cotton and tea plantations and rail construction programs in the British colonies in the West Indies, Africa and Southeast Asia. From 1834 to the end of World War I, Britain had transported 2 million Indian indentured workers to 19 countries, including Fiji, Mauritius, Ceylon, Trinidad, Guyana, Malaysia, Uganda, Kenya and South Africa. And descendants of these indentured labourers, and as I'm sure you know, make up a large proportion of the current population of these countries. I will be talking about the work of 3 of these descendants. First, V.S. Naipaul, born in 1932 in Trinidad, grandson of indentured labourers. His father was from a poor family but was given an education by rich relatives. Naipaul travelled to England in 1950 on a government scholarship at a time when Trinidad was still a British colony. He published his first novel, The Mystic Monsieur, in 1957, and of course had a very successful literary career as a novelist and travel writer. He won the Booker Prize in 1971 for In a Free State and the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2001. He was knighted by the British government in 1989, and of course he died in August 2018. Now we have Setendra Pratap Nandan and his daughter Kavita. Setendra was born in 1939 in Fiji, grandson of indentured labourers transported from India. He travelled to India to study and taught at the University of the South Pacific from 1969. He became the Minister for Education in the Fijian government, which was overthrown in 1987 by Colonel Rambuka, and subsequently lived in exile in Australia for some years. He's now an emeritus professor at the Australian National University, and he's published several books of poetry, short stories and memoirs. His daughter Kavita is at Macquarie University in Sydney and is a novelist and academic. Now, narratives in the indenture system tend to follow a pattern, with illiterate and impoverished Indians tricked into signing an agreement which they don't understand, and beset by bitter regret, as well as the harsh treatment and the punishing labour. At the end of their period of indenture, they are adrift in a foreign land. In his 2001 Nobel Prize lecture, for instance, V.S. Naipaul writes, People indentured themselves for 5 years to serve on the estates. At the end of this time, they were given a small piece of land, perhaps 5 acres, or a passage back to India. In 1917, perhaps because of agitation by Gandhi and others, the indenture system was abolished. And perhaps because of this, or for some other reason, the pledge of land or repatriation was dishonoured for many of these later arrivals. These people were absolutely destitute. They slept in the streets of Port of Spain in Trinidad. When I was a child, I saw them, he says. He uses the gender-neutral term people here, but elsewhere these people are all men. In A House for Mr Biswas, 1961, of course, a novel based on his father's life, he describes the evening assembly of old men squatting on sacks on the ground and on tables now empty of tulsi goods, pulling at clay chilams that glowed red and smelled of ganja and burnt sacking. Though it was not cold, many had scarves over their heads and around their necks. This detail made them look foreign and, to Mr Biswas, romantic. It was the time of day for which they lived. They could not speak English and were not interested in the land where they lived. It was the place where they had come for a short time and stayed longer than they expected. They continually talked of going back to India, but when the opportunity came, many refused, afraid of the unknown, afraid to leave the familiar temporariness. In House for Mr Biswas, he doesn't use the word indentured, but it's clear who these people, that's who these people were. In The Middle Passage from 1962, he meets a former indentured Indian in Suriname, a derelict man in a derelict land, who holds for Naipaul the full desolation that came to those who made the Middle Passage. In Away in the World, he describes seeing homeless people during his first walk in Port of Spain with his father, that Sunday before the war, he says. Most of these people were Indians. Many of them would have been indentured immigrants from India who had served out their indenture on the sugar estates, and then for one reason or another, perhaps they had become drinkers, perhaps they hadn't been given their promised passage back to India, perhaps they'd quarrelled with their families, had found themselves with nowhere to live. These people were without money, job, without anything like a family, without the English language, without any kind of representation. They were utterly destitute. They were people who had been, as in a fairy story, lifted up from the peasantry of India and set down thousands of miles away. Now, passages like these have created in me, without very much thought, the impression that the indenture, as well as being a paradigm of cruelty and exploitation, was entirely a male phenomenon, that women were not included. This obvious fallacy was challenged recently when I read Setendra Nandan's poem, Lines Across Black Waters, which is published in this book of the same name. Part 2 of Nandan's poem, Tota's Tale, begins, "To every 100 men, 40 women, indentured to the CSR company." Thus alerted, I began to see women everywhere among the labourers, in Naipaul's work, both fiction and non-fiction. For one thing, family life is a recurring feature in the lines or barracks he describes. Even the destitute men in Away in the World have hypothetical families with whom they have quarrelled. The Indian immigrants do not mix with the local inhabitants. They have brought their social and cultural structures with them along with their scanty household goods. By the time Mr Biswas moves to his mother-in-law's estate at Greenvale, the indenture system would have been abolished for a decade or more. But clearly the Barrack Room into which he moves his family is a legacy and continuation of that time. The barracks gave one room to one family and sheltered 12 families in one long room divided into 12. The corrugated iron roof projected on one side to make a long gallery. divided by rough partitions into 12 kitchen spaces, so open that when it rained hard, 12 cooks had to take 12 coal pots into 12 rooms. Families and coal pots imply the presence of women. This is confirmed disquietingly by the description of Christmas at the barracks. It was from the start a day of abandoned eating and drinking, and was to end not with the beating of children, but with the beating of wives. Mr Biswas's brothers are labourers on other estates, while he is a driver and overseer on the Tulsi estate. He imagines them shuffling forward in similar slow, submissive queues to receive payment from other overseers. He visits them and their wives from nondescript families on Boxing Day. When his daughter Savi is alone with Mr Biswas at Greenvale, an old woman who was spending time with her son, his wife and 5 children in a barrack room, gives her food. So the female presence among the labourers in Naipaul's fiction is actually pervasive. In his essay, Writing a House for Mr Biswas, Naipaul admits that he was writing of events twice removed, in an antique pastoral time, and almost a land of the imagination. It does not tell a literal truth. His novel was based not on archival research or even interviews with relatives, but on memories of my father's conversation and his short stories. In A House for Mr Biswas, women are usually wives and mothers and daughters, defined in relation to their men. Even Mr Biswas's mother-in-law, the powerful Mrs Tulsi, gains her influence only from her position in the eminent and wealthy Tulsi family. When they are first introduced in A House for Mr Biswas, they are described as a pious, conservative landowning family. However, little was really known about this family. The late pundit Tulsi's money had not come from labouring, and it remained a mystery why he emigrated as a labourer. Unlike other immigrants, he kept in touch with his family back in India, which still flourished in India. The deference paid to the pundit in his native district followed him to Trinidad, and now that he was dead, attached to his family. As I say, Naipaul never uses the word indenture in this novel, but Pundit Tulsi would presumably have come to Trinidad under the Indentured Labour system. Patrick French, in his very fine biography of V.S. Naipaul, provides some details of Naipaul's maternal grandfather, Kapil Deo Maharaj, or Kapil Dev, the real-life original of Pundit Tulsi, trying to sort out the history from the family law. Although he came to Trinidad under the indenture scheme, he was from a Brahmin family and used Sanskrit and could read the scriptures. His contract was bought out, perhaps by his wife Suji's father. He became renowned as a pundit, and his business acumen allowed him to become wealthy. So the Indian community in Trinidad sorts itself out on lines which perhaps mirror the caste and wealth divisions of the societies from which they come. Vijay Mishra notes that the struggle for space that is at the centre of barrack life is repeated in Hanuman House itself, where, apart from Mrs Tulsi, her sons and her brother-in-law, no one ever gets enough space. The space of the novel, A House for Mr Biswas, that is an arena, the earlier space of ships and barracks, where the history of an old Indian diaspora is played out. He points out that food rations on the sugar plantations from Suriname to Mauritius to Fiji were identical for all indentured Indian labourers. The indenture experience is in its tastes, its smells, physical surroundings, shared across the sugar-growing regions all around the Earth's low latitudes. It is in later works we find out more, as Naipaul himself finds out more about his family background. In an area of darkness, he describes visiting the village of the Dubes. Dubes is a pseudonym for the family, and meeting a woman, Jusodra, who had been to Trinidad. She knew my grandfather, he says. These two bald facts are not elaborated in the book, but they hint at a more intriguing story. Naipaul's grandfather, Pandit Kapil Deo, had left his wife, Suji, in Trinidad, eloped with Jusodra, a married woman, and returned to India with her. He didn't survive the journey. In Finding the Centre, Naipaul elaborates. He died on the train from Calcutta. The woman with him had to make her way to the village, no doubt reciting the address I had heard my mother recite. And there, for all these years, in the house of my grandfather's brother, she had stayed. She still had a few words of English. She had photographs of our family, things of Trinidad, to show. There remained to her the curious vanity that she knew us all very well. Patrick French describes the visit. Jusodra took him to a hut. He held his feet and wept. He includes a quote from Naipaul's letter to his wife, Pat, written at the time of the visit. French says, he was left feeling that Kapil Deo had been a man of exceptional force of character. Naipaul says, I admire him for his 3 wives, for his decision to abandon all, however temporarily, for love much more than I have ever done. As you can imagine, I fell in love with these beautiful people, and they're so beautiful women who have all the boldness and independence, no coyness of Brahmin women. That's Naipaul's letter to his own wife. He followed this up in the letter with some affectionate words for his wife, perhaps trying to take the sting out of this admission that he admired his grandfather for marital infidelity. But in any case, it's rather a surprise to learn that Suji Kapil Deo, the original Mrs. Tulsi, was not just a widow but an abandoned wife. Perhaps she had reasons for capricious behaviour and periodic recourse to her sickbed. Mrs. Tulsi often fainted. When this happened, a complex ritual was at once set in motion. One daughter fanned Mrs. Tulsi, 2 massaged her smooth, shining and surprisingly firm legs. One soaked bay rum into her loosened hair and massaged her forehead. The sons-in-law found themselves alone in the wooden house with the children, who knew without being told that they had to be silent. All activity was suspended. The house became dead. One of the sons-in-law was invariably responsible for precipitating Mrs. Tulsi's faint. He was now hounded by silence and hostility. On this occasion, that's described there, as on so many, Mr. Biswas was that son-in-law who had precipitated the faint. The next morning, Mrs. Tulsi came into the hall, fatigued and heavy. Without her teeth, she looked decrepit, but there was about her decrepitude a quality of everlastingness. Her moods are treated in Biswas as an inexplicable and immutable facts of life, part of the seeming permanence of Hanuman House, in contrast to the mutability and impermanence of his whole life. The story of the Tulsi family seems to be a departure from the standard indenture narrative. But the other side of the family appears more typical. Mr. Biswas's brothers are labourers. His sister is a servant. His mother, Bipti, lives derelict and dependent in a village mud hut in a back trace. But despite their destitution, they are conscious of their Brahmin caste, and when the sister, Dehuti, runs away with the yard boy, the lowest of the low, Bipti feels the disgrace keenly. It's only through luck and the charity of his aunt that Mr. Biswas is sent to school and thus develops the means to make himself into a writer. The aunt, Tara, is Bipti's sister. Tara was a person of standing. It was her fate to be childless, but it was also her fate to have married a man who had, at one bound, freed himself from the land and acquired wealth. Seemingly out of the blue, Tara decides that Mr Biswas is to become a pundit. In finding the centre, we discover, as once again, as Naipaul himself does, the background to this decision. He meets a cousin who tells him that his grandmother, Naipaul's aunt, and his father Sipasad's sister, the woman we know as Dehuti in Biswas, is dying. He visits her in Port of Spain. She was attended by children and grandchildren, people of varying levels of education and skill. Here, as everywhere else in Trinidad, there had been movement. My father's sister, at the end of her life, could see success. She had something to tell him of caste and blood, like her bequest to me. The story concerning her father, Naipaul's paternal grandfather, and his mother. About 1880, in the ancient town of Ayodhya, in the United Provinces in India, a young girl of the Barrack clan gave birth to a son. She must have been deeply disgraced because she was willing to go alone with her baby to a far-off island to which other people of the region were going. She intended her son to be a pundit, and in the district of Diego Martin in Trinidad, she found a good pundit who was willing to take her son in and instruct him. There was no hint in the story, in the tale I heard, of sugar estates and barracks and contract labour. This pundit-trained son is the basis for the character we know as Raghu in A House for Mr Biswas, the husband of Bipti, the tyrannical father who drowns early in the novel, leaving his family defenceless and destitute, despite the money which is supposed to be buried somewhere on his land. But he did bequeath to Naipaul's father the destiny of his caste, and explains why his aunt decided to have him trained as a pundit. More interesting to me in this story is the woman who travels alone with her possibly illegitimate son to Trinidad. In Coolie Woman, Gayutra Bahadur, the great-granddaughter of Sujaria, a woman who travelled to British Guiana in 1903 as an indentured labourer, published an account of her quest for her ancestors' story. Sujaria was single and pregnant when she embarked on the Clyde in Calcutta, and her child was born on the journey. Bahadur points out that the indenture story is not a simple one of the ignorant, exploited and enslaved. The story is more nuanced than that, especially for women. Men well outnumbered women in all the colonies, and it gave women sexual leverage, which of course was at best an ambiguous advantage and led to high levels of violence against women. However, although she can find out her ancestors' age, the name of her father and the village she came from, she can't know whether this woman had willingly left or not, or how she came to leave and who she truly was. A waylaid religious pilgrim, a widow, a fugitive from an abusive marriage, a woman deserted by her husband. Like Naipaul's great-grandmother, she was a high caste woman alone with a child who, by choice or by compulsion, travelled across the black waters to the Caribbean. Whether towards the promise of a better life or away from the threat of disgrace or abuse, we can't know. Bahadur writes, I could read the woman only through the often sexist, racist eyes of government and plantation officials who had vested interests, economic, careerist, sexual, in telling the story from their own perspectives. Only 1/3 of these women came accompanied by men. Naipaul's great-grandmother was apparently not unusual in travelling alone with her child. An article, a 1986 article by Rhoda Reddick in Caribbean Quarterly, delves into the archives to find out the background to the Indian woman problem among the indentured labourers. The disparity of numbers, between women and men was a problem from the beginning. Far fewer women were recruited, and a number of reasons could be used to explain this. The approach towards the recruitment of women varied over time in relation to the desire of the plantocracy and the exigencies of the recruiting situation as mediated through the policies of colonial authorities, including the relative necessity to reproduce the labour force locally and the need to stabilise the male labour force and the problems incurred in securing the right kind of woman. Ratios of women to men were set by the colonial authorities, beginning with 1 woman to every 7 in 1844, changing over the period from 1 woman to every 3 men to 1 woman to every 2 men, and changing in 1860 to 1 woman to every 4 men. The routine sexism of the authorities is quite blatant. The moral character of women was thoroughly investigated in a way not considered important in relation to the men. Some magistrates insisted that a recruiter provide evidence that he had been to a woman's village and obtained the sanction of her husband for her to go abroad. It's not difficult to imagine the problems that this would have caused for women trying to escape from a violent marriage or similar unpleasant domestic situation. However, not all 19th century British men were so judgmental. G.A. Grierson, for example, an ethnographer and linguist, wrote in 1883 that the best sort of female recruit was drawn from those abandoned and unfaithful wives who could make a fresh start by getting out of the home environment. Many magistrates refused to register an absconding wife. But, said Grierson, women have rights too, and if an alienated wife was determined to go, no officer has a right to stop her. Reddick believes that many Indian women, probably for the first time in their lives, got an opportunity to exercise a degree of control over their social and sexual lives, which they had never had before. The majority of women who did migrate were already independent women who were seeking a new life. This situation in relation to the women differed greatly from the desires of the men. To them, migration was an attempt at improving their economic and, if possible, their caste status. Reddick writes, Brahmin widows comprised a large proportion of those migrating, given the abhorrent position of widows in India, and the remaining number usually comprised women who had left their husbands or had been deserted by them, for whom prostitution or destitution was the only remaining alternative in India. A smaller number included unmarried women who were pregnant or already practicing prostitutes, seeking a new life. Thus, it can be seen that the decision to emigrate alone was a sign of their strength, as Reddick remarks. This brings to mind the powerful widows in A House for Mr Biswas, not only Mrs Tulsi, but her widow daughters, the fearsome widows who, when not cooking or washing or cleaning or looking after the cows, or making coffee or chocolate or coconut oil or grinding maize, they worked like men. Well, I would suggest that perhaps they worked harder than men. The ratio was altered again in the 1880s, the ratio of men and women, to 2 men to every 5 men, to every 5 men, meaning equating to every 100 men, 40 women, as Setendra Nandan writes in Lines Across Black Waters. Margaret Mitra writes that in relation to Fiji, where the indentured system began in 1879, a ratio of 40 adult women to 100 adult men was followed as per the requirement of the immigration laws and regulations of India. Totaram Sanadia arrived in Fiji in 1893 as an indentured labourer. He has left one of the few first-person accounts from the indentured labourer's point of view. I was led to his story of the haunted line by Setendra's poem, which includes a poetic version of Tota's tale. Bridge V. Lal and Barry Scheinberg, in their introduction to Totaram's story, cite his main themes as playing a crucial role in bringing out the abolition of indenture in Fiji. The harshness of the plantation life, the plight of the indentured women, and the shaming of India into action. Totaram describes the plight of the women in the coolie lines. To think that they had come from India. Is this the place where thousands of heroic women in Rajputana immolated themselves on funeral pyres to preserve their honour? Times have changed indeed. Bharat, you are no longer the country you once were. Today, Indian mothers and sisters, separated from their parents, husbands and sons, are found in the coolie lines of Fiji. You put these women in the cage of indenture, rendering them powerless, and sent them overseas to work as slaves. In every way, you have deprived them of their independence. No longer able to protect their honour and dignity, they will become degraded and face countless hardships. It doesn't seem to occur to Totaram that independent women might consider self-immolation a less desirable fate than 5 years of agricultural work. Reddick writes that in spite of many cases of kidnapping, enticement and false information, it's clear that a large proportion of women did make a conscious decision to seek a new life elsewhere. In Nandan's poem, Totaram's lament for the women is summarised. I thought of Sati Savitri, Anusuya, Sita abducted to another island, those Rajput princesses immolating life upon a pyre for dead men, like trees in fire. Sati Savitri implies, I believe, a wife totally devoted to her husband, even to death. Even V.S. Naipaul, not noted for his feminist sympathies, agrees that the Hindutva idea of a woman should not confine her in the Sita Savitra mould. Dilip Padgaonkar proposed this in an interview with Naipaul, who responded, "That is dreadful, and that needs to be fought for many reasons." For many coolie women, indenture may have been a way of escaping perhaps that idea of womanhood. Although she doesn't mention Totaram Sanad here, Reddick notes that Fiji appeared to be the focal point of discussion in the campaign against the indenture, which was seen as one against the slavery of men and the prostitution of women. The agricultural labour of women was rarely seen as significant. They were, of course, paid much less for their equivalent work, and in most contemporary reports, it was assumed that their value was in providing stable domesticity and reproducing a new generation of workers. On the contrary, Reddick states, the women of the agricultural castes were not then or now housewives. Kavita Ivy Nandan's short story, The Red Sari, makes this point rather neatly. While in outline it is a story of two men misled into boarding a boat to Fiji and leaving their thriving sweep-making businesses and families behind, with subsequent regrets, ending in violence and tragedy, the woman who attracts the attention of one of the sons is seen weeding a lane of cane with a hoe. A red cotton sari was wrapped tightly around her thin body, and one end was tucked efficiently into the side of her waist. Her hair was tied in a simple knot, which rested on the nape of her neck. She hoed the cane with the strength of a man, but in tune to the song which she was sweetly singing. Lekha, this woman, is only seen from a distance by the adoring Ram, so we have no insight into her particular story or her thoughts about her predicament. But in this scene, at least, she seems to be holding her own efficiently and happily with her male colleagues, with energy and stamina left over for singing. Kavita's story thus shows the two sides of the female indentured experience identified by Reddick and Bahadur, the capable worker and the vulnerable woman as sexual object trapped in a potentially violent situation. Margaret Mitra has excavated one such story from the archives. the murder, apparently not atypical but particularly brutal in this case, of a woman, Morley, by a jealous former partner or husband. Mitra writes, Morley was murdered because of her sex, but also as a consequence of a host of other interlocking variables. An understanding of the context of indenture, for instance, the ratio of men to women, and how this is linked to the reclamation of ijut, the general dreariness of plantation life, and demographic information, has enabled us to recover the tragic story of an 18-year-old subaltern woman who defied patriarchal attempts to contain her behaviour and sexuality. This combination of factors, the patriarchal system where women are possessions, exacerbated by the disparity in numbers between the sexes, meant that the conflicting pressures on many women who were the objects of male desire and at the same time expected to be well-behaved, faithful wives, must sometimes have been intense. There are, of course, other views of the significance and role of women among the Indian indentured immigrants. Setendra's poem attests to the importance of the female inheritance from which an emigrating generation was torn. Shipwrecked, trapped by history, without the grammar of grandmothers, they died in hope and dread, he writes. He recounts Tota's dream of returning to India and his mother, who feeds him the comforting food of childhood until he wakes, hungry and alone in his haunted line or barrack. Setendra also recounts something of the trials and dramas of a woman's life among the indentured labourers in his memoir, Nandi, Memories of a River. His maternal grandmother, a midwife in a village 6 difficult miles from the nearest health centre, a dramatic tale of birth and near death passed to Setendra from his mother via his sister. Let me give Mr Biswas the final word, as imagined by Ratna Raman. Raman projects the later life of Vidya Naipal's mother, Draupadi, onto Sharma in a clever shift of perspective. Mohan did very little for his mother. My son Anand did even less for us, although in his case he was given so much more. His sister Savi was made of finer stuff. She too had left for England to pursue higher studies. Hearing of her father's illness, she hurtled back home. I got a job as a manager in one of Mai's quarries. Not a white-collar job, really, but when you stop to think of it today in my ancestral country, women labour on construction sites and quarries, unskilled, and can never earn the wages that men receive, nor can they become managers. Finding a foothold in a male universe and managing to look out for her daughters. Yes, Mai did that for most of her life, and that is the gift she extended to each one of her daughters. In truth, I was the one was making unwarranted assumptions when I thought that the indentured labourers were all men. Women were always there, between the lines, in the works of Naipal and Nandan, working alongside their husbands, sons and countrymen. Most, if not all, suffered deprivation and the tyranny of back-breaking, unforgiving work. Some did well, some didn't survive. The bitter legacy of endemic domestic violence is the inheritance of some women, as Bahadur discovered when researching her ancestors' story in Guyana, and also in Fiji, as Margaret Mitra recounts. For others like Draupadi Naipal and her mother Suji Kapildeo, the transplantation from India to a new land led eventually to a certain liberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. And now, I really, it was a very wonderful session. And now I request the audience, if they have any questions or observations regarding this lecture, please feel free to write in the chat box in YouTube, and we will certainly pass them to our respected ma'am. And with your permission, ma'am, there are a few questions that already has been posted, and I would like to read out to them. Or okay.
Okay.
Okay, the first question that was posted by Sohini Sen. Ma'am, can you throw some light on the cultural and identity shift of such indentured laborers?
Oh, the cultural and identity shift of the Indian indentured labourers. Was that the question?
Yes, ma'am.
Ah, that's
Yes,
interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
I think, look, I'm far from an expert. There are probably people who are watching who know more than I do about this. But it seems that they retained their cultural and social structures within, because they were kept as a separate. They weren't allowed to mix with the local population, so they were kept separately in the barracks on the plantations. So I think that was the sort of legacy. But later, of course, after the indenture was abolished, they started to mix with the community more, I think.
Okay, the next one is, why are there such less narratives about women indentured laborers?
That's a good question. I think, perhaps we are perhaps people like Kavita Nandan is interested in making that difference, and I'm sure that there are more. I'm not across all the narratives about the indentured labourers, so there may well be more now. So go out and find them and write them, and yes.
Okay, the next one is, what is the difference in representation of women laborers in Nepal and Nandan's work?
Well, Nandan's poem, Setendra's poem is very much from the point of view of Totaram, this chap who came to, so it's a very sort of first-person account. Kavita Nandan shows this indentured woman working on the fields. In Naipal's work, really the women are. It's a legacy of the indenture, really, but the women are really very domestic, part of the domestic scene. But as I said, his aunts, all his mother's sisters, worked very, very hard. If you remember, in A House for Mr Biswas, they were formidable women, especially the widows. They would work on the plantation, and then they would bring up their children, and they would work very, very hard.
And next one is, what is the current status of the indentured laborers?
Well, the indenture was abolished in, I think it was 1917. The system of indenture was abolished throughout the British Empire, and so there are no. I'm sure there's still indentured labour. There's still slavery in the world, isn't there? As we know, but it's not that particular structure of the indentured labour within the British Commonwealth, the British Empire, doesn't exist now.
Okay, the next one is, how much these indentured laborers are justified through literary narratives?
What was the question? Sorry.
how much these indentured laborers are justified through literary narratives?
Justified.
Yes.
That's an interesting. I don't think that the system of indentured labour is really justified. Most of the literature that I'm aware of is from the point of view of the indentured labourers, and is really about the hardships and about the difficulties and about the injustice of the system, and about really how it was not so very different to slavery. You know, slavery was abolished, so they couldn't call this system slavery anymore. They had to get people to sign a form, a piece of paper, before they could be taken. But they could be tricked into that. They could be kidnapped. You know, so it was not quite slavery, but it wasn't very far different from slavery.
Okay,
And that's
ma'am.
usually reflected in the literature. Yeah.
Okay, the next one is why V.S. Naipaul has a negative perspective towards India, although he himself belongs to India by ancestors.
That's a big question. I don't think that Naipaul had a negative view of India particularly. I think if you read all of his books about India, everything he's written about India, he is, particularly if you read Among the Believers, he's much more positive about India than he is about Pakistan. India, A Million Mutinies Now is quite an optimistic book about India. I think in his own way he sort of loved India, but and he did feel part of India, but you know, he was such a fragmented and diasporic character, such a complex man. You know, he couldn't really just express a simple emotion like that.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. These are the questions that has been posted in the chat box, and I tried to take most of them. And thank you for your lecture.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And now we move to our next speaker, who has already joined the group, and she is Dr. Chandra Chakraborty. And before giving mic to her, let me introduce her briefly, though most of you know about her. Though it is my duty, so I will do so. She is professor in the Department of English and director of the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media at West Bengal State University, West Bengal, India. Her research areas interests include literature of the long 18th century, 19th century Bengal, gender and cultural studies. Among her recent publications are her monograph, Gendering the Nation, Identity, Politics, and the English Stage, The Long 18th Century, that was published by Orient Black Swan in 2013. Relocating Tagore's Binodini, New Spaces of Representation in Rituparno's Chokher Bali, in IAFOR, Journal of Literature and Librarianship, Japan 2013. The King in Rabindranath Tagore's drama, Political Power Reinscribed in Raja, in the Politics and Reception of Rabindranath Tagore's drama, edited by A. Bhattacharya and M. Ranganathan. Routledge Advances in Theatre and Performance Series, USA. She has edited a volume of essays titled The New Woman in Tagore, The Making and Unmaking of Female Subjectivity. She is also actively involved with the designing of textbook for elective and core English courses for graduation and post-graduation levels under the prescribed CBCS curriculum of the University Grants Commission, India. Now, I would like to request Professor Chandra Chakraborty, ma'am, to begin the lecture. It's to you, ma'am.
Thank you for such a generous introduction, and also thanks to the college and to the organizer of the seminar for having me on board. My paper, as you know, is Chicklet in India, at the crossroads of gender anxiety and post-feminism. Well, in the middle of the 2000s, novels written by Indian women featuring a single woman's adventure in work and romance joined a transnational genre of writing called chicklet, epitomized by novels such as Bridget Jones' Diary and Sex and the City. While chicklet has garnered some scholarly attention, studies remain largely focused on Anglo-American writing, even while acknowledging the genre's global spread. The emergence of chicklet in India roughly a decade after the chicklet boom in the West is a cultural offshoot of economic liberalization, making the novels a useful lens through which to observe the formation of a new feminine neoliberal subjectivity, that is the Indian singleton. Chicklet novels are popularly regarded as modern-day fairy tales, offering guilty pleasures and purely escapist reading. As a form of commercial fiction, their literary aesthetic merit is often weak, but their popularity is usually phenomenal, as they cater to mass readership fantasy. An easy identification with the protagonist is achieved, usually through the presentation of an imperfect heroine, condemned by literary purists often as silly, frothy, and often tasteless. Liberal critics are, however, very enthusiastic about the skyrocketing popularity of this particular genre or subgenre and the public demand of chicklet. Thus, given the worldwide popularity and the serious women-centric themes addressed by it, chicklet does qualify to be recognized as a literary force. In a post-liberal society, chicklet narratives incorporate and appropriate the trends of post-feminism in trying to blend the importance of female emancipation with the forces of consumerism, diaspora, and globalization. Most scholarly analysis of chicklet employ the frame of post-feminism. For instance, Michelle Glasberg's dissertation is titled Chicklet, the New Face of Post-Feminist Fiction, and it claims that all chicklet novels try to inculcate the values of commodity fetish and certain beauty myths among young women. Juliet Wells contends that the serious aspects of these narratives lie in the fact that they all show the problems concerning female growth and maturation in the most comprehensive manner possible. In her words, every chicklet heroine inevitably learns to appreciate herself for who she is. Studies by Jennifer Barber, Paula Kent, Caroline Smith focus on the nexus between popular literature, women's freedom, and their simultaneous commodification by exploring a variety of literary and cultural instances. However, post-feminism as a discourse remains highly contentious, and it would be wrong to assume that it has been blindly appropriated by the others of the Western chicklet. In the American academic discourse, post-feminism is a term used to describe a societal perception that since most of the goals of feminism have been achieved, further expansion or iteration of the movement is not necessary. The definitional uncertainty of the term led to several positions, such as an epistemological break with the second wave feminism. It has been perceived mainly as a media and publishing phenomenon, as a radical new way by which young women try to engage in feminist activities, and signaling therefore a historical shift towards the third wave. And it has also been largely seen as an ethos or a sensibility rather than as a critical movement. Here, I would particularly like to read out an excerpt from Rosalind Gill's Post-Feminism Media Culture Elements of a Sensibility, because it quite succinctly kind of summarizes the main features of the post-feminist discourse. And I read out from Gill. In order to fashion a concept that can be used analytically within cultural studies, post-feminism is best understood as a distinctive sensibility made of a number of interrelated themes. These include the notion that femininity is a bodily property, the shift from objectification to subjectification, an emphasis upon self-surveillance, monitoring, and self-discipline, a focus on individualism, choice, and empowerment, the dominance of a makeover paradigm, and a resurgence of ideas about natural sexual difference. It is precisely the patterned articulation of these ideas that constitutes a post-feminist sensibility, unquote. To understand the rather nebulous status of post-feminism as an ideological discourse in Western academia, I shall be drawing heavily upon the research of Elaine Hall and Maureen Salipo Rodriguez, who says that post-feminism actually rests on 4 pillars. Number 1, the decline of feminism in the 1980s and 90s. Second, simultaneous rise in anti-feminist sentiments among women. Third, the fear of being labeled as a feminist in the light of the negative connotation of feminism as man-hating or sexist. And fourth, the growth of a no-but culture whereby a woman did not want to be labeled as a feminist but supported the goals of feminism. To this, another pillar can be added, the feminism, because feminism was seen as exclusionary because it women's equality rather than human equality. So in today's context, a kind of humanism is the need of the hour. Tentatively, therefore, perceived as a kind of a middle ground between feminism and anti-feminism, post-feminism, in my opinion, emerges from a disregard for the complexities of feminism itself. Moreover, categorizations of Chicklet and definitions of post-feminism as neoliberal stem from a disregard for the polysemic nature of cultural texts. Instead, we need to consider how in specific cultural contexts, the texts allow for visions of individual agency and collective change within the constraints of contemporary consumer citizenship. Therefore, the conclusions drawn from the studies of Anglo-American Chicklet cannot be blindly mapped onto Chicklet's others. Indian Chicklet adapted different strategies to reflect transnational themes and negotiate the tension between traditional mores of life and contemporary social changes prompted by globalization. Post-feminism as a theoretical discourse emerged in India almost a decade later with the onset of the new millennium and demands a nuanced theorization. While it was engendered by certain political and economic specificities at the turn of the millennium, in India it did not mark either the death of feminism or a simplistic return to the issues of the second wave Western feminism. In fact, in India, the feminist movement was never a mere imitation of the West, but a discourse and praxis inflected by the vectors of location, caste, class, religion, dress, food, and even language. In theorizing the new Indian woman, Sundarajan points out that the liberation of women is separated from the contemporary women's movement by making liberation a matter of individual women's achievement and choice. The development of the new woman is made to appear as a natural outcome of benevolent capitalist socioeconomic forces. This is from Real and Imagined Women. Hence, when India woke up to the realities and opportunities of a global neoliberal nation, post-feminism emerged as an ideological premise in response to the lived realities of the urban, independent, educated, cosmopolitan women. Therefore, in the Indian context, the word post would perhaps mean an extension of the parameters of feminism. A conflict between conservative values and emergent social traits have always been at the root of the anxiety produced by every epistemic shift. Such a tussle manifests through generational conflict, chauvinistic attitudes, provincialism, religious beliefs also seeped into urban spaces to characterize women's experience, choices, and predicaments. Women are often seen as the repositories of a nation's religion's or community's honor, that men are judged according to how well their women conform to socially accepted norms of behavior. The post-feminist features in the novels, which I have selected for today's reading, namely Abha Davish's Baby Ji, published in 2005, and Anuja Chauhan's The Zoya Factor, published in 2008 and also later made into a film, might not have a radical and transformative presence, taken that chicklit is very commercial and mainstream, and it refuses often to question and unsettle normative social and cultural trends. But by referring to issues like the growth of womanhood in a consumerist and pro-Western context, they disturb the uneasy balance of tradition and modernity in conservative societies. While tradition and modernity are conceptualized in these narratives as binaries, the protagonists seem to be attempting to negotiate the two and reinscribe a new selfhood. Moreover, some chick-lit novels also bring to the forefront the rise of lesbian subcultures, the liberalization of sexual values, and the complexity of our sexual subjectivities with a global market economy. They narrativize the ways in which individual female sexual subject positions change or get influenced by exposure to global attitudes, and articulate a private self that disagrees with the taboo against female sexual freedom in orthodox cultures. Ira Trivedi's book, India in Love, Marriage and Sexuality in the 21st Century, emphasizes the invisibility of lesbian women in India and echoes what Ruth Vanitha had already articulated. However, beneath the meta-narratives of patriarchal resistance and assertion of traditional family values, there is a strong and continuous articulation of lesbian sexual autonomy as a closet and personal experience. Let us come to the first novel. Abha Davish's Baby Ji is a tantalizing and radical exploration of girlhood in globalized urban India of the 21st century. A fascinating coming-of-age story of the sexual exploits of a Delhi schoolgirl in a 12th standard. The novel is a post-feminist critique of hegemonic values and questions the process of gendering through its negation of essentialism and binary mode of thinking. Davish places her fiercely sensuous heroine Anamika, that is Baby Ji, in the context of a globalized and thoroughly consumerist Indian society struggling to negotiate its traditional moral values and gender expectations. Baby Ji is a narrative replete with the tropes and conventions of a typical rite of passage story, where the post-puberty phase of a girl's sexual and psychological awakening is explored with astute shrewdness and subtle humor. The focus of the plot is more on the girl protagonist's private world of thoughts, opinions, and proclivities as she comes to terms with the larger social mores and manners of metropolitan city life. Davish focuses mainly on two things: how a teenager evolves from a half-child to a half-adult state, and how society influences or retards that growth. The novel depicts an India which has been reinvented with the rise of the newly minted great Indian middle class, eager to fit into a globalized world. Anamika seems to have a love-hate relationship with her home city. Her Delhi is confused, morally dishonest, with its covert, surreptitious ways resulting from skyrocketing changes, which leave young, susceptible minds dizzy and pulsating with forbidden desires. And I quote from the text. This is how Anamika describes her Delhi. Delhi is a city where things happened undercover. In the Delhi I grew up, everything happened. Married women fell in love with pubescent girls, boys climbed up sewage pipes to consort with their neighbors' wives, and students went down their science teachers in the lab, but no one ever talked about it. The importance of a youthful urban middle-class demographic makes special sense in the context of Anamika's India, as it is more representative of the future India than any other demographic. It would be apt to note that India is one of the world's youngest countries, slated to be the youngest nation of the world by this year, that is 2020, and its sexual revolution is also of the young. In such a transitional phase of cultural reorientation, the tension between opposite polarities are conspicuous. The violent oscillations between arranged marriages and virtual dating, puritanism and pornography, heteronormativity and lesbianism. The change is drastic and disturbing as premarital sex becomes rampant in urban areas and high schools. Sex comes out of the closet into the open road with images of half-nude women in billboards, TV commercials, and mainstream films. The newfound pleasure principle brings with it a dark side of this revolution, that is, excessive forms of perversion and violence as obvious manifestations in a society repressed for decades. This is Anamika Sharma's Social World. Here I turn again to Ira Trivedi to explain what makes Anamika's contradictions and resistances possible. And I quote from Trivedi: "The sex revolution does not just concern the physical act. It is about changing laws, about loosening censors, and about more sexual liberty. It is about seeing women choosing to wear what they want, and about accepting gays in our communities. It is about the burgeoning prostitution industry and pornography. It is about escaping hypocrisy and realizing we are making change happen. Above all, it is about exposing an entire generation to a heavily sexualized culture which is seeping into their lives." The title, Babyji, is interesting and also fraught with contradictions. It is a word of endearment used for a higher class infant by a servant. In the novel Rani, the maid with whom Anamika establishes a homoerotic connection addresses her as Babyji. It is ironic as it questions the cultural politics of desexualizing the body of an adolescent girl by calling her an infant. And Anamika questions, was I a baby or a didi? That is, an elder sister. Babyji is such a contradiction in terms. In India, girlhood became an important site of contestation, assertion, and erasure from the mid-19th century till the present time. The discursive emphasis on girlhood is contingent upon the existence of a cognitive political problem space. The Indian domestic culture, which has gone through several phases of restructuring with various socio-political and economic shifts, is a similar problem space, and the relation of this space to the shaping of the public sphere has always been fraught with tensions. Davishir here uses sexual freedom as a metaphor for various kinds of freedom. As Anamika says, I decided I would avenge myself by holding hands and flirting with girls, since Indian society was so holier than thou about having boyfriends. As Anamika enters puberty, she begins to deconstruct all essential notions of Indian womanhood through an assertion of a difference and a personal mix of identities. She begins celebrating her freedom by establishing physical relations with two women, one of whom she names, and quite significantly, she renames as India. It is India whose physical proximity makes her feel like an adult. Women and lesbians are both cultural artifacts. But unlike woman, the lesbian refutes the heterosexually fixed connection between gender and sexuality. As the text explores women's pleasure and fantasy, it establishes a connection between body and enactment to question the patriarchal unconscious. This also means that every act of defiance is preceded by an acknowledgement of the patriarchal premises. In the text, Anamika talks about how her physical involvement with India changed her self-perception. I quote, "My coming of age was distinct and happened in a split second. All my life, I had been taught to venerate elders, but physical relation with India transformed her from an elder to a sexual being, an equal. It made me an adult," unquote. Anamika is also projected as a very serious and meritorious young girl aspiring to study abroad, but her success in academic pursuits is always undercut by an equally strong sense of a burgeoning bodily craving and its consequent satisfaction through bisexual adventures. Strangely, her sexual imaginings and academic ponderings merge seamlessly. And she says, with two affairs, one was torn between two simple choices. I was reading a popular book on chaos theory, which said that 3 implied chaos. I wanted chaos because I could create my own patterns with it. But her chaotic subversion of accepted social values also brings to her deep anxiety and guilt about her desperate ways. And she reflects that a cacophony of real and imagined lovers filled my head. They were screaming, shouting, accusing me of treachery and betrayal, infidelity and disloyalty. India and Sheila, Rani and Adit, Vidur and Chakradev, my mother, Mrs. Pillai and Deepak, all grievously claimed injury and showed me the damage I had done. The story is loaded with minute descriptions of Anamika's relationship with various characters who walk in and out of her life, leaving her giddy with feelings of triumph, guilt, and exhilaration, all overwhelming her mind at the same time. It is indeed mysterious that her parents never find out about her secret adventures, neither do they imagine that their young and growing daughter can have such an active love life. In fact, Anamika secretively circumvents the conservatism of her family and finally plans to leave her mother country for pursuing her higher studies in the US. Here she would be able to assuage her guilt-ridden conscience and escape the orthodoxy of Indian society. So this was our Baby Ji. The next novel that I commit to reading is Anuja Chauhan's The Zoya Factor, which has a very interesting tagline, all's fair in love and cricket. By using this sentence or this line, she kind of situates the novel in a familiar Romance tradition and associates it at the same time with a fervent nationalist spirit that colors popular attitude towards the game of cricket in India. The book, written in the first person, describes how a cricket-hating ad executive, Zoya, is forced to become a part of the Indian cricket team not as a player or a cheerleader, but as a lucky charm. Zoya was born on 25th June 1983, at the exact moment when Kapil Dev's India won the Prudential World Cup. Since then, she has been very lucky as far as cricket is concerned, and whichever team has a meal or a drink with her before a match ends up winning the match. When the IBCC, India's cricket board, discovers this, she is scheduled into accompanying the Indian team to Australia and help them win back the World Cup. But the Indian captain Nikhil Koda believes more in hard work than in dumb luck, and so always ends up fighting with Zoya. After her unblemished record, Zoya is targeted also by the international media, who believe that India has an unfair and unnatural advantage. The rest of the story is about whether a simple girl like Zoya can handle these pressures and help Team India win the World Cup. The story from the beginning to the climax is outright funny, and it is beset with the hilarious contradictions of the postmodern Indian society. When the IBCC coaxed Zoya to join the team, resistances from her father and Zoya's own uncertainty made her initially turn down the offer. But the enthusiasm of her family in arranging a meeting with her Anita Chachi's nephew Kattu for, what her family calls the marriage point of view, made the 27-year-old woman wake up to a sense of self-worth. The meeting leaves her pondering, and this is indeed hilarious. I quote from the text, "Had I gone through 2 heartbreaks to end up with this? This was the hero of the movie of my life? Because hello, I have grown up thinking I'm starring in DDLG or Titanic or at least Bride and Prejudice. And all the time it's actually been Dunstan checks in." Her sickening feeling of claustrophobia in Kattu's company finally leads to the resolution. I wanted excitement, I wanted adventure, I wanted out. Come Friday, I'm going to the Kotla. This might sound a very post-feminist self-assertion, but her family cannot let their daughter explore unknown terrains in the company of unknown men. So Zoya is finally allowed to join the Indian team on condition of being chaperoned by her Rinku Chachi and friend Monita. Zoya is no cricket buff. She is unimpressed by the sport and she calls it the great Indian disease, worse than dengue or polio or tuberculosis, and she feels that we should be vaccinated against it right from the moment we are born. The game is presented in its recent spectacular avatar, no more a prolonged, tedious game, but more aggressive, glamorous, and highly corporatized in its scintillating combination of money, media, and glamour, including business ties with Bollywood stars and corporate houses. The center of all this has shifted from England to the Indian subcontinent, with its commercial underpinnings closely tied to economic liberalization. Since its colonial inception, in India, cricket has been perceived as a masculine sport and a means of reclaiming nation's honor. This is, however, belied by the increasing number of female cricket fans, sports journalists, commentators, and the glitzy female cheerleaders who provide some sort of a glamour quotient to the game. Zoya's involvement with the game as a lucky charm sounds feasible, therefore, in a country where anything and everything seems possible. Yet, she seems as an interloper, made particularly evident in the descriptions of her presence as the sole female among the boys in blue at breakfast. Early on, in an angry exchange between Zoya and Nikhil, the captain of the Indian team, who remains cynical of Zoya's inclusion and grudgingly allows it to boost the morale of his boys, asks, "How far are you willing to go for your country?" He is alluding to the commonly held belief that facilitating the team's win is a patriotic duty. This is how Baba Linganath, who is the guru of president of the team, describes Zoya's planetary positions. The very cosmos bowed to the prayers of a united Bharat and wrought mighty changes in the arrangement in the paths of the planets that day in June 1983. Owing to which an entirely propitious girl child and avatar of Durga Ma herself was born. Zoya confesses that though I stand up for the national anthem and cried when the fat child made all the Goras sing Sare Jahan Se Acha in Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, but the truth of my patriotism has never really been tested. She is contrasted not just to Nikhil, who ostensibly fights for India on the cricket pitch, but also her brother Zoravar, who is a soldier and a real patriot in the Indian army. Nevertheless, by making Zoya the goddess of luck to the players, Chauhan adds a new twist to the otherwise manly image of cricket as sports. While the nation's pride and future are established by the male warriors sweating out in the fields, Zoya as a lucky charm is there to ensure that these manly pursuits are crowned with success. Her construction as the incarnation of India's fortune by media is perfectly in sync with the Indian goddess tradition, that is the deity fixated as a passive icon, a beacon of destiny, inspiring valiant warriors to fight the real battle. Needless to say that deification of women in Indian culture is a patriarchal strategy whereby a woman is dehumanized. The same, nevertheless, exposes Zoya to public scorn, gossip, and vilification. The gossip columns in Indian and Australian newspapers buzz with Zoya's news, and the reports oscillate between a frenzied euphoria for a special power to intense hatred and dismissal. The Australian media take Zoya's presence as an opportunity to vilify the Indian team, making Zoya's struggle even more difficult against an unreal hype, sneering, nasty reporting, and the undue expectation of an entire country. And she tells us that the lunatic fringe of the Australian media, meanwhile, was baying for my blood with harsh headlines such as "It's not cricket," "Go home Zoya," "Level the playing field," "Mighty Indians hide behind girls," etc., etc. And again, as India enters the semi-final, resentment for India's Zoya advantage gets intenser and nasty. The controversy about Zoya's role as goddess with the power to win India victory on the proxy battlefield of cricket is intensified in the penultimate section of the novel, when Zoya is forced to decide whether she will stay with the team and influence their win or retreat and allow Nikhil to claim a victory on his own. It turns out that Zoravar has been injured in the real battlefield on the India-Pakistan border, telling us quite unambiguously who the real patriots are. Zoravar also saves Zoya from betraying Nikhil and the team by seeing through the nefarious plan of the IBCC chief to discredit Nikhil and the team by hyping up Zoya. Thus, it is the heroic rationality of her brother that helps Zoya, the goddess, see through the illusory temptations of fame, money, and worldly power. And it saves her when she emotionally endangers her own life. Zoya, however, makes her own decision not to go back to Australia and assists the team in its win. She is now tamed as the domesticated goddess, allowing Nikhil to shine in the spotlight, although this leaves her publicly abused and financially uncompensated. Nevertheless, victory is not eventually withheld from Zoya, and it lies in heterosexual coupledom. She does shine as the heroine of the movie of her life on securing the love of the captain of the World Cup winning Indian team. The conclusion is foregone given the genre to which the novel belongs. However, in reinscribing the post-feminist heroine, it depicts post-feminist heroine. The novel depicts Zoya's troubled consciousness, torn apart by the constant conflict between the stylish ad executive, the goddess of love, a naive lover going weak at her knees in the company of the Indian skipper, a sexually experienced woman who finds the connection between purity and propitiousness ridiculous, and finally, the dutiful Indian wife making parathas for her husband. All these myriad identities appear in succession, leaving Zoya fragmented and troubled. However, the climax of the novel not only brings about a closure of the romantic plot, but also a nationalist closure, which can only be reached if the goddess steps back so that her sons can defend her honor. This is made possible by Zoya's rather Austenian realization that love is greater than pride and prejudice. The Zoya factor eventually brings the bits and parts of the fragmented protagonist to a synthesis. This is fully articulated by Zoya, who repeatedly stresses her allegiance to newer forms of local culture and place, such as her emotional bonding to her Delhi neighborhood, represented in dress, language, and food. Distressing self-fragmentation makes room for a synthetic self, which is contrasted with the ideals of the goddess she is supposed to embody. She might embrace the absurdity of an anything can happen in India, but finally refuses to bow down to its chauvinistic expectations. Let me now kind of sum up what we have been able to decode from this reading of the two novels that I've chosen. In the Indian context, the historical conjuncture of the 1990s and the entrenchment of neoliberalism in the new millennium necessitated an assessment of female identity. As more middle-class women entered the workforce and engaged with Western norms in both work and romance, the need to craft selves that took into account both tradition and modernity arose. The features of the romance narrative popular in the pages of Harlequin books, or Mills and Boon for that matter, adapted itself to local Indian cultures and reflected a tension between a post-feminist celebration of women's body, sexuality, freedom, choice on the one hand, and a critique of these on the other. Baby G celebrates a narcissistic, self-regulating, individualistic gaze to underscore the importance of sexual subjectification and yet remains an investigation of morality. Abha Daveshwar places an innocent but fiercely sensuous heroine in the context of a globalized and thoroughly consumerist Indian society, struggling to negotiate its traditional moral values and gender expectations. Anamika becomes phallic through her masculine successes with two women, but also attempts to conceal this by flirting and taking up a feminine identity in the presence of men. As the text rides Anamika's body and destroys binary possibilities, she experiences an exhilaration comparable to jouissance. And she says, drifting off, I dreamt that India and I were revolving around each other as particles, and then suddenly transformed into waves, tides, currents. Psychoanalytically, jouissance is opposed to lack. Anamika's homoerotic performances releases her from normative heterosexuality and also proves its fictitious nature. Baby G subverts the parameters of romantic fiction, a woman's genre that arouses desire through representation of virginal goodness. It also resists the expectations of a pornography in which women are reduced to passive bodies available for servicing men sexually. The novel is a radical reading of today's Indian culture, which deconstructs patriarchal normative values and seeks alternatives in a post-patriarchal future. The romance in the Zoya factor comes from the journey towards heterosexual coupledom being played out against the backdrop of the game of cricket and national synthesis. Singh proposes that since independence, I'm referring to Jyotsna Singh's work, Colonial Narratives, Cultural Dialogue. Well, Singh proposes that since independence, the Indo-Anglian realist novel illustrates Benedict Anderson's formulation of imagined communities, having given a sociological solidity to disparate actors and actions and woven together or elided the material disparities and discursive instabilities of a nation in formation to make an imagined community seem natural and inevitable. Chauhan's novel, while crafted skillfully as a comedy, continues this nationalist project. An analysis of dress, language, fashion, values reflected in the novel clearly shows while chick-lit protagonists do not completely eschew tradition, and indeed in some cases reclaim it, they do not commit also to be the vanguard of an essentially Indian core. Rather, they seem to be insisting on the right to make inconsistent choices, to embody the Indian and the global at different junctures of their life as it suited them, rejecting the idea of, and I quote, matching, in favor of mixing and matching the traditional and the modern, as Zoya does with her choice of clothing, language, or food, such as aloo tikki burger and chicken tandoori pizza, or her penchant for English. Both the novels, critique conservative and neoliberal ideologies in post-economic liberalization India and chart the struggles of women negotiating troubled terrains to arrive at a sense of self, a term which can be explained by using the words of Vimal Dissanayake as denoting the imaginary register consisting of identifications, narratives, formulations, and images that serve the notion of the individual. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Really, it was a very interesting and very insightful lecture. And with your permission, ma'am, can I take some questions from the audience?
Sure, please do.
Okay, ma'am. The first question that was asked by Ambarish Upopadhyay, how does contemporary sensibilities and gender and class intellectualities shape post-feminism?
Contemporary sensibilities and gender and class?
And class inequalities, sorry. Inequalities? Yes, ma'am.
Inequalities? Then the rest of the question?
Shape post-feminism.
Well, Ambarish, you see, the chicklet as a genre is quite limited, of course, in its application because it mainly deals with upper class or maybe the new middle class who are kind of, escalating themselves to the level of the upper class women. So these women are educated, they are single, they are professionals. Therefore, the question of class distinction doesn't really come into play so far as the genre of chicklet is concerned. Of course, if we consider Anuradha Chauhan's Battle for Victoria, there we have women's participation in politics where she has to negotiate different kinds of regional expectations. So that is there. But what is important is the assertion of women and the self-assertion of women as an independent, autonomous agent who can define herself and move beyond patriarchal expectations. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, does Zoya's disinterestedness towards cricket shows cricket to be masculine sport?
Sport, whether cricket or football, is usually looked upon as masculine in India. If you look at the colonial history of cricket and football, they had all been sort of, adopted by the Indian people to reclaim their national honor. So Zoya's interest is her disinterest towards cricket is a personal choice. She doesn't like the game of cricket, and she also doesn't find any meaning in the kind of euphoria that makes people mad when a match is played. But she also recognizes that it is a game which kind of unites India, though as an imaginary community. And it is a game which in today's context involves a lot of money and glamour. Apart, something that she also tastes when she becomes a part of the team or officially appointed as a part of the Indian team as their lucky charm. Okay?
Okay, ma'am. The next one, the women position has been transformed from household women to cosmopolitan women. Then why most of the novel portrays women as sorry figure?
Sorry figure.
Yes,
I don't
ma'am.
think they really portray women as sorry figure. The point is that a feminist reader might be disappointed with the way Chicklit presents women characters, but there is no denial of femininity in the world of in the world of Chicklit, and for that matter, post-feminism also does not deny femininity. It in fact it values it, and there is no denial of women's craving for a good husband or a loving boyfriend. That is also there. Okay, so there is a perhaps when we ask such questions, we are perhaps thinking from a very strict feminist point of view, which perhaps led to the kind of stigmatization of against feminism as a kind of a man-hating discourse, okay, or a sexist discourse.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, can the increasing visibility of diverse identities be seen at a fallout of post-feminism?
As a fallout of post-feminism? No.
Yes, ma'am.
Why should it be regarded as a fallout of post-feminism? Because do we really have one single identity? I mean, once again, the kind of, the trend to stereotype somebody or woman as one, as a kind of a organic one whole is again a very flawed way of looking at woman. There are different kinds of identities which form us. One can be a teacher, a mother, a wife, and all these identities are part of us. So this is not a fallout of post-feminism, but this is what is demanded by the post-feminist praxis and discourse.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, can the women portrayed in Sikh literature are cultured and educated, but then why do they have to resort to mixing and matching instead of remaining true to traditions?
Why do they have to remain true to traditions? Tradition has to be remade all the time. I mean, there is nothing called absolute fixed tradition. I mean, if you're unable to reinterpret tradition to meet the demands of life, of life which is constantly changing, then tradition is of no good. If it tries to hold you back, then it is of no good.
Okay. The next one is, does Chicklit, by exploring sexuality, tries to challenge patriarchal structure?
Yes, it does. That is what I've been talking about in the course of the talk lecture.
Please clarify the concept of rebellious women and new women from feminist point of view.
Rebellious women and new women.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, new women, if you look at the concept of new women, even the Victorian England and Victorian and colonial India experienced the new women. Any woman who goes against accepted societal values or expectations can be described as rebellious. Rebellious is a rather pejorative term which kind of, cast a negative light on a woman who, on anybody, any person who is trying to subvert or question or challenge certain principles or values of society. So I don't see any kind of any problem between the two terms. I mean, it depends on the perspective from which one is looking at them.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is there any political corner of Joya not being supported by the captain of the cricket team?
There is not such an angle in the novel, so far as I've understood it. No. Joya is, of course, asked to join politics because political parties wanted to exploit her hyped status in India as a lucky charm of the Indian team. So she was asked to join politics, but she refuses to do that.
How does contemporary sensibilities and gender? Okay, ma'am. It was answered. Is not deification of women just another patriarchal strategy to silence them through the elevation, and it is also with domestication?
Yes, of course. That's what I said. That it's a patriarchal strategy of dehumanizing and desexualizing women. It is a patriarchal strategy.
Okay. Could ma'am repeat the name and author of Anamika Sharma's novel? Google could not help much.
Anamika Sharma's novel is Abha Davesh's novel Baby G, and Baby G, the name of the protagonist is Anamika Sharma. The writer is Abha Daveshar. The title of the novel is Baby G, and the name of the character is Anamika Sharma.
Okay, ma'am. Why writers are more interested to portray women as a struggler, to want to stand against the patriarchal panics?
Because women had always been looked upon as a second sex. She has always been subdued by patriarchal institutions. So that has happened in all society, irrespective of time and location, geographical location. Something that gives rise to a kind of the notion of women's subculture, or maybe what Garda Launer calls that that feeling of that bonding, that common sisterhood that one feels, although they're very different from one another.
Okay, there is a question by Sanjeev Dev Sharma. Ma'am, will you please explain the term chick lit literature?
Chick lit has been variously interpreted. The term was first coined by Chris Mazza and Jeffrey Jeschel to refer ironically to the various fictions that they compiled in their anthology called Chick Lit Post-Feminist Fiction, and this was published in 1995. Very interestingly, Mazza explains that why the term was used, and she says that it was created not to embrace an old, frivolous or coquettish image of woman, but to take responsibility for our part in the damaging, lingering stereotypes that are always used. Women are always stereotypically represented. So we break the stereotype and we take responsibility for breaking the stereotypes. Okay. And chick lits can be of different types. I mean, you can categorize chick lit literature into various subcategories, such as there can be romantic chick lit. For instance, the Bridget Jones Diary, which is a rewriting of Pride and Prejudice. The Zoya Factor is a romantic chick lit. Battle for Victoria can also be explained as a romantic chick lit. Then you have fashion chick lit. For instance, The Devil Wears Prada. We have crossover chick lit, such as The Village Bride of Beverly Hills. We have shopping chick lit like Retail Therapy. There is a mommy chick lit, for instance, The Big Nap. We have Bollywood chick lit, Salam Paris. And there is chick lit, teen chick lit, and Baby G is an instance of example of teen chick lit.
Okay, the next question, ma'am. The idea of post-feminism in chick lit has been portrayed in a negative way. What is your take on that? What are the other angles with which this genre can be evaluated other than post-feminism?
Who says that it has been portrayed in a negative way? I mean, I don't understand the question, because why should the idea of post-feminism be portrayed in a negative way? Post-feminism evolved to be a new kind of a sensibility or ethos in the Indian context. I tried to differentiate it from the Anglo-American discourse. And I said that how this whole concept, this rather Western derivative, has been indigenized in India. Okay, there is no question of portraying it in negative light.
Okay,
And again,
ma'am.
there is once again, I also said something very categorically, that there is no kind of an imagined battle going on between feminism and post-feminism so far as India is concerned, because it came to India almost a decade after the concept was in vogue in the Anglo-American academia and popular discourse.
Okay, ma'am. This question has been asked twice. That please define phallogocentrism according to you.
There is nothing to do with me. Phallogocentrism is something that has been used by Laka. So I would advise the person to go and read up Laka to understand what is phallus plus logos plus centricism. You know, it is the law of the father. Okay, it is not a term that I've coined.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And the last question of you for you: can chick-lit be seen as a tool to resist and counter gender discrimination in post-feminist era?
Yes, it is. That is what the whole discussion has been about. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your lecture. And really, it was a very wonderful session. Thank you from the college, from our department. I thank you twice, because previously once you delivered a lecture for our students, and today you have done better than that. Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Welcome. And now we move to our next and final lecture of the webinar, that will be delivered by Dr. Munia Bhaumik, and she has already joined us. And before handing her the mic, I should tell about her briefly. She is assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature, Emory University, USA. Her research interests include comparative literature and philosophy, race, colonialism and sexuality, queer feminist theory, democracy, equality and citizenship. As a scholar, she draws upon the literature and philosophy to reconfigure concepts of social justice, equality, democracy and citizenship. Her writings and teachings are mostly animated by students, philosophers, and activists who seek modes of finding more egalitarian modes of living together. She is the author of monograph In Liberty's Shadow, The Non-Citizen in American Letters and Law. In 2020, she will be a faculty fellow at Stanford University. Now, I request her to begin the lecture. It's to you, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. You are perfectly audible, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Boshkar, Mr. Shorkar, Professor Shorkar, for the invitation. অনেকদিন পরে আমি কলকাতায় নেই। আপনারা কি কলকাতায় না ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গলে অন্য জায়গায়?
ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গল থেকে ম্যাম, কিন্তু আমাদের কলেজটা হচ্ছে বেলডাঙ্গা মুর্শিদাবাদে, কিন্তু বেসিক্যালি ফ্রম ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গল।
ওকে, সো অনেক ধন্যবাদ। আমি কলকাতায় জন্মেছিলাম, কিন্তু 5 বছর বয়সে এই দেশে এসেছি, এই ইউনাইটেড স্টেটস। কোনোদিন এই দেশ আমার দেশ মনে হয়নি। So I'm very happy to speak to you today. I want to just say that my specialization is not actually postcolonial literature, although I have studied quite a bit of the scholarship. But I am actually work on questions of race and sexuality in American, the history of American literature and politics here in the United States. My interest is not a patriotic one in the United States in the least, but it's rather one in which to contest restrictive citizenship rights here, the history of racial brutality, and what we can learn from that for gender studies more generally. So I will speak about that and try to link it with the questions that you're posing. Unfortunately, I was not able to hear your full lecture, Professor Chakraborty. It's 7:30 in the morning here, but I did hear some of the comments, and so I hope that we can have a dialogue and a discussion. I'm not sure how much time I have for the lecture. What's the format?
Yes, ma'am, you can speak up to 1 hour, ma'am. There is no problem with time.
Okay, so I will present for about 20 minutes on some issues here in the United States, and that it prompts for thinking about gender studies, and perhaps within the hour time we can have a discussion. Would that be all right?
It will be absolutely fine, ma'am. Please carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just say, to give a little bit of context, for instance, we are all literature scholars, I believe, here, and gender studies. So my book, the one that I've just finished, is about a set of texts from the 19th century, and it focuses quite a bit on Herman Melville, but also conditions of slavery and abolitionist narratives from the 19th century during a pivotal moment of anti-slavery, which shaped the writings of Melville, African-American, a body of African-American philosophy and thought from David Walker, who was an abolitionist in 1829 and wrote a book called The Appeal for the Colored Citizens of the World. And this became a kind of foundational text of Pan-Africanism. The writings of Frederick Douglass, who was himself enslaved. He was a philosopher, a very prominent speaker, and W.E.B. Du Bois. So I consider this whole period to think about questions of race, citizenship, and democracy. So just to give you some context about where my specialization lies and how I bring that to bear upon questions of feminism that we're facing today. Over the last course of the few months, our daily lives, our campuses, and our classrooms have in some ways been subject to accommodate a world here that has fundamentally changed the social life and social function of higher education. While the crisis in the United States is one of public health, the coronavirus cases this morning reported by the New York Times is 4,248,492 cases. India, I believe, has 1.34 million cases now. Both India and the United States are among the leaders in infected cases as of today. Over half of the residents in the United States are now unemployed. Many are uninsured. They have no access to health care. Schools are generally closed with no state-sponsored provision for the care of children. We know that this unduly affects women in many ways. The most affected have been single mothers, which is a huge population of working mothers here in the United States. So why do I bring this up, and how does it connect to the 19th century? What I want us to consider today is what is the relationship between gender studies, feminism. I am actually not a post-feminist. I'm still within schools of philosophies of feminism. I should say that I was trained at the University of California at Berkeley and by the feminist philosopher Judith Butler, who directed my dissertation. So I have been schooled in certain theories of gender, and I would like to keep that conversation open about questions of subjectivity, subjection, and desire as it bears upon this question of democracy. So one of the things that has happened here in the United States, and you will see in feminist theory today too, is about the question of state violence and what are feminist responses to state violence and autocracy. We know from the readings of classics from Antigone on that one of the tenets of feminism, as we find in figures such as Antigone, is to speak out against state violence and repression. And so I'm going to bring to you the example of what is happening in the United States and things which with many of us are feminists, are philosophers, are involved, but I would also like to hear and learn about your own intellectual discussions in India. You may have seen, for instance, the primarily peaceful protests that have manifested in the United States over the summer. I will speak more about these protests throughout the talk and how they intersect with questions of feminist philosophy. Many in the United States have mobilized under the rubric Black Lives Matter. A recent New York Times piece found that nearly 15 to 26 million people who live in the United States in some way participated in these manifestations, prompting the summer of this past summer, which we're still in, of 2020, to be among the time of the greatest social movement and mobilization in the United States history, in the history of social movements here. Millions have united under these three words, Black Lives Matter, and provoked in part these protests by the horrific video of an unarmed Black man by the name of George Floyd, who was killed and tortured in Minneapolis by the foot of a police officer stepping on his neck. As he grasped for breath, he uttered, "I can't breathe." He called for his mama as he died, which it means his mother. 3 police officers stood by without intervening in what the millions who have marched understood as a clear incidence of state racial cruelty. Have you been familiar with the news reports on these protests in India? Professor, has news of these protests? I have news. Yes. Okay, you've seen the images and the coverage?
Yes, ma'am, yes.
Okay. The scene of a Black man assaulted and violated at the hands of the police is not an unfamiliar scene. It has its roots in the 19th century and in the foundation of the state. But this recent video image of George Floyd being tortured has stirred a traumatic recollection of the racial cruelty perpetrated against Black Americans through the institution of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is an institution which was not separate, but concomitant with British imperialism and colonialism. As in the Caribbean islands, both slavery and colonialism coalesced on sugar plantations and tobacco fields. Slavery was the brutal designation of a human life as a thing or another's property. The sociologist Orlando Patterson has described the condition of being denigrated, sold, and raped, and being held in bodily captivity as another's property as constituting social death. Social death is the concept phrase that the view of a living body before the law is as an object, as property. This means, for instance, it's a legal and socio-political nullity. It is the condition of being declared a thing. This is what I want to premise and really highlight as the pervasive culture of racial cruelty sanctioned in the United States and sanctioned in American jurisprudence. The question that I would like us to consider today, as this is a colloquium on gender and postcolonial studies, is, do Black Lives Matter to a postcolonial critique of gender norms, what the previous speaker said, of phallogocentrism? Certainly the African-American struggle for rights in the 1950s and 1960s, understood as what became the civil rights movement, with known figures such as Martin Luther King here in the United States, was always in alliance with the non-cooperation movement in South Asia. Martin Luther King was a devoted student of Gandhi. He studied Gandhi's texts very carefully. Afro-Asian solidarity was also a key tenet of the Bandung Conference. So do Black Lives Matter in gender and postcolonial studies in India today? The pandemic, and here as well, the pandemic and the governmental mismanagement of this public health crisis generates again questions of biopolitics. It generates questions of the intense scrutiny of the erosion of democracy and democratic protocols, and it brings us to what is also the focus in feminist theory through, as we have seen in the writings of Judith Butler, on precarity. What is precarious life? Butler argues that precarity is not incidental to her earlier work on gender studies and gender trouble. Gender studies is not a study simply of women's identity, but rather an inquiry based on ethics, feminist ethics of care, and attention to conditions of social vulnerability or precarity. Recently, for instance, the turn has been to look at the conditions of dispossession, what it means to face dispossession from rights, from shelter, and from bodily security. The critique of gender norms teaches us that violence, any form of violence, whether it be legally sanctioned or state sanctioned, is enacted based on assumptions of accepted masculinities and femininities. It is not unrelated, then, George Floyd's torture to increasing autocratic straight politics in the United States. I don't know if you have seen, but let me just recount that one of the really pivotal moments over the summer here in the United States was when the United States president, along with members of his cabinet and the Department of Justice, opened fire on peaceful protesters outside the White House in an area of Washington, D.C. called Lafayette Park, and the protesters were tear gassed. Did you see coverage of that in India?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
We have seen that.
Okay. So this is a violation of the very premise of the idea of democracy as it was founded in the United States, which is founded on the idea of constitutional democracy. So there's no legislated leader who's considered the law here. It's actually in the philosophical concept of constitutional democracy. It's the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is the law. It is the role of the functionaries to uphold the rights. And the First Amendment of the Constitution is the right to peaceful assembly, is the right to peaceful protest. And what we have seen in the summer, and we saw in the scene at Lafayette Park outside Washington, D.C., is the violation of this right of peaceful protest. Just last week, one stark thing that happened, and many of us are very concerned, is that peaceful protesters in the city of Portland, many of them were grabbed and disappeared in unmarked vans that were unidentified police, that was unclear if they worked for the government or not. And many peaceful protesters. And I must say, as a professor and teacher here, there has been, the student involvement in these protests has been very active. It is the youth that are leading many of these protests and are mobilizing under the rubric of the 3 words, Black Lives Matter. And so we are concerned about youth being harmed. So that has been at the forefront also of feminist debates and feminist studies here. It's not separate from gender studies. So for the purpose of this talk, I give this context, and I invite your questions also, as I hope this will be a shared dialogue more than merely a lecture about the importance of the title of my talk, which is called Listening to Black Feminism. Listening to Black feminism is a critical task for postcolonial critiques of gender. As a scholar of the 19th century Americas, when the institution of slavery, what I have stated Orlando Patterson describes as social death, was the norm, here, so too was British imperialism increasingly entrenching its brutality and gender protocols across the world. I have been challenged by readings of slave testimonies from the 19th century and narratives of the period, such as one of the only written texts that remain of a girl child who was enslaved. And that text is called Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Jacobs actually wrote, a white woman actually transcribed this text, but it's one of the only written texts in the context of the United States that is a slave testimony. Other famous slave testimonies, for instance, include Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom. But they're mostly from the subject position of a male enslaved person. Black feminists such as Saidiya Hartman, who's currently a professor at Columbia University and the author of 3 books which have become very important readings of feminism here in the United States. Her first book is called Scenes of Subjection. It now celebrated its 20th anniversary and has shaped an entire body of feminist scholarship on questions of Black feminism here in the United States. For those of you who are interested, you can see the 20th anniversary reception of Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection. It was an 8-hour conference held at Rutgers University in New York, and there is a YouTube of that conference. And it will give some context of what are the questions that Black feminists are teaching us and raising about questions of subjectivity, desire, and also, but from the vantage point of having the historical legacy, the historical trauma, and in the context of the 19th century, the material condition of being enslaved as sexual property, the condition of female slaves under chattel slavery in the United States. If you were designated property, you were also considered the master's sexual property. And this is not separate from context of colonialization, where also colonized women, as was very pervasive under French imperialism in Africa, were designated sexual property and sexualized in many ways, as we've learned by colonial authorities. Now we have come to think of Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, which reads very carefully the 19th century slave narrative of Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, as very carefully as a text of feminist philosophy, Black feminist philosophy. Hartman thinks through the category of subjection and subjectivity, and conditions of terror that were prompted by the racial politics of the United States. She challenges us to listen, to hear, to an Afro-descendant female slave who was routinely raped on order of her master. And she challenges this listening to be done to promote a notion of a relationship to this wound and to grief, to Black feminist grief, Black female grief, and Black grief more generally. Black feminists such as Horton Spillers, who is now a professor at Vanderbilt University, penned a very important essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, which has now also become a classic text of thinking about race and gender here in the United States. This body of scholarship of Black feminism challenges us to examine the cruel reproductive politics under slavery and its epistemic consequences for thinking about problems of dominance under also colonialism. The condition of Blackness that we find before the law here in the United States is also found in the testimonies, as we found, for instance, in George Floyd's torture. George Floyd was not given a trial. He was grasping for air. The slogan here is that has been recounted and mobilized is the slogan, "I can't breathe," which has been uttered in many conditions of police brutality. And what does this indicate? In some ways, it indicates the impossibility of legal redress for Black subjects. Under American law, under chattel slavery, we know, for instance, that chattel slavery was not illegal. It was a legal institution. It was legalized through the Constitution of the United States. While the United States produced this language of rights, the Bill of Rights, notions of democracy, the brutal contradiction is that it also legislated slavery. And Frederick Douglass would talk about the US Constitution as the way in which constitutional law developed in the United States as an instrument of slavery. One example, for instance, is that if you were enslaved, you could not give a testimony in court. So what does this indicate? That there's something that there's haunted by slavery in the scene of George Floyd's torture. And that is the impossibility of legal redress, right? George Floyd did not have the legal right to a trial. And much of this is predicated on the view of Black life as an object, as a thing, as property. And this legislates the violation of a human body before the law. In listening to Black feminism, as I suggest that we do, we can also turn to the writings of Sylvia Wynter, the Caribbean postcolonial, whose writings are instrumental to Black feminism, but also Caribbean postcolonial studies. In listening to Sylvia Wynter, she complicates theories of the human, because Black life was always seen as that was never considered human. Black life was denied the category of personhood under the law. So why should postcolonial studies listen to Black feminism? Well, the very idea of property that Ranajit Guha's teachings have put forth in the colonial context are complicated by the study of chattel slavery, in which a human life, not just land, not just objects, but human life, what Marx to some degree would understand as the commodification of a thing, as commodity fetishism. Its most egregious example is the designation of a human life as a slave, which continues to haunt the United States and its legal scenes. Listening to Black feminism also complicates and adds. It doesn't necessarily replace, but adds to the account of the gendered subaltern, which has come to shape postcolonial studies. There was a recent dialogue, for instance, between Angela Davis and Gayatri Spivak, which begs listening to. The point of listening to Black and this is also available on YouTube for those that want to consider this comparison further. The point of listening to Black feminism in South Asia or in South Asian studies in the United States is not to iterate a sameness. Part of the challenge of Black Lives Matter is to undo what in the United States has become a white supremacist appropriation of a phrase, all lives matter. There's a particularity to Blackness that is being asserted that requires confronting. The project of thinking about what is the relationship of Black and postcolonial feminism is not one to assert one's sameness, but rather to note in the differences the still persistent struggle for democracy and equality that once formed a transformative Afro-Asian coalition that spanned from the social movements of Black America to South Asia, to the anti-colonial mobilizations of South Asia. What happened in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s through mobilizations of non-cooperation in South Asia have been documented, studied, and were very tied to the development of a civil rights movement in the United States. African American periodicals, African American writings from the 50s and 60s show the way in which what happened in South Asia was a beacon for thinking about civil disobedience movements here in the United States. Today, in the writings of Black feminist authors from Saidiya Hartman, Horton Spillers, Sylvia Wynter to Angela Davis is an invitation for us to again think about modes of Afro-Asian solidarity. We will perhaps again find our own rage for change and a wild longing not to be owned. That is a premise of Black feminism, the premise of never being someone's property, never being held bodily captive, never facing police brutality, and thinking about these forms of subjugation. Listening to Black feminism gives the accounts of subjectivity and desire that have been central to feminist studies an entirely new context and name. We have, on the one hand, a trajectory of feminist thought from Wollstonecraft to Simone de Beauvoir, and to what some would say to Butler, that puts forth terms of recognition in their gendered way, but also these are questions of human existence. There has been in that trajectory questions of what are gendered modes of discrimination, violence, and abuse. They have also aggressively sought ways of philosophical, political, and socio-material lines between woman and human. But what Black feminism makes us confront is the sedimented figure of the enslaved woman, and how that troubles very constitutions of humanness, also in a Western genealogy of feminism. There is a conceptual need to see women's subjectification as Black women's subjectification as a prerogative of gender studies everywhere, and the movement for what is this prerogative never to be owned, post-enslavement as a prerogative of Black feminine studies, is very important, I think, for us to encounter again, and to see ourselves in postcolonial studies in relationship to Black feminist knowledge producers, critical authorities, and to think about the challenge and epistemic value that they pose for our own intellectual trajectories. So I will end there, and I welcome any questions. I am speaking, from the vantage point of teaching, and both as a scholar of American literature and race, and somebody who's lived here for the last 40 years of my life. So I am speaking in some ways as an outsider, although it's always been my country in some way. So I invite your questions also, and I invite you to teach me about what is happening in your own discourses and dialogue of in Bengal.
Okay, with your permission, ma'am, I would like to inform my audiences that if they have any questions, then they can write in the chat box, and we'll certainly pass them to our respected ma'am. And before that, some questions have already been posted, and I will just read out to you. Okay, ma'am?
Okay.
Okay. The first one is, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. May you please describe that from the Black Lives Matter protest?
Yes. So Black Lives Matter, and I should say that I'm an ally, right? I don't speak for the subject position of all the organizers who've done an enormous amount of work to generate this movement. I should say the first organizers were women, men and feminists, who started this movement. It's a non-hierarchical movement that started with the pervasive problem of police brutality that is rampant in the United States, in the history of the United States, towards Black living beings. So that's why it may seem like a simple phrase, Black Lives Matter, but that is the phrase that has been insistent upon. And one of the reasons is because Black lives have not mattered, both in the socio-political culture, but also especially is in the legal setting. The majority of people who are incarcerated here, that means in prison, are African Americans, and there's a lot of data. I'm not a quantitative person, as you know. I'm a literary scholar, but there is a lot of data about this. Angela Davis, do you read the work of Angela Davis? Do you know Angela Davis in feminist circles or philosophical circles in India? Yes or no? I'm just asking if you know Angela Davis.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. So, for instance, Angela Davis's work, right? She's thinking about the 19th century tradition of abolition, right? Which was the movement to abolish slavery here, which coincided, by the way, with anti-colonial movements in the 19th century in South Asia. And so she has a book called Abolition Democracy. And abolition democracy is the idea of looking at for Angela Davis and another very important critic here, who's actually a geographer. Her name is Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who writes about the prison industrial complex. So why is it they have asked Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis that imprisonment, that the death penalty, which is still legal in 30-something states in the United States here, and has prompted a lot of discussion over cruelty, over forms of cruel punishment in the legal setting. Why is it that Black lives are more subject to incarceration? Why is it racialized? Why is the question race so central to why is it that there's systemic racism? So one of the things that Black Lives Matter is doing is really trying to not just expose, but challenge these structures of systemic racism. And there's a lot of scholarship. This, the university has not been separate from these discussions. There are a lot of articles, and I would be happy to share with you, Professor Chorkar, if there is interest, bibliographies and articles between philosophers. Judith Butler, for instance, gave a talk on why it's Black Lives Matter and not all lives matter, and why that's central to all the philosophical questions and deliberations which have taken place here about philosophies of life, right? I don't know if you've read Butler's Precarious Life, which is a book that came out a little while ago on the ideas of precarity and questions of life, right? Precarious life. So feminism is as much concerned with, female subjectivity as it is with feminist ethics of acknowledging injustice, as the questioner said, of acknowledging vulnerability. The new volume of work that has been produced on questions of dispossession, for instance, and that's only a partial answer. I do invite you to read. The movement has not just generated a lot of discourse, but it's generated a lot of academic scholarship. And there are a number of articles and there are a number of texts that discuss what Black Lives Matter is mobilizing for.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is why the main feminine movement does not take into consideration the Dalit women movement.
I think that is a very important question, and there has been important work that is being done. If we look back, again, this is not my area of specialties, but I think that if we look back at the writings of Ambedkar and that Ambedkar saw himself, as did many African Americans who wrote at the same time, in alliance. And so the anti-Dalit discrimination movement is very much, I think, a example that is historically in alliance with what is happening here. Of course, there are specificities, right? Caste, and how do we compare? And that's part of the work that needs to be done. How do we compare modes of subjugation under caste with modes of subjugation under what has been constituted here? The scholarship is turning to what is anti-Blackness, right? What has been anti-Blackness in the Constitution, one could say, of Western modernity. And this is not unrelated, right, to the critique of colonialism and also caste. So what would be a way of creating a feminist alliance that would really understand and premise the anti-Dalit discrimination movement and Black Lives Matter? I think that is a question that Ambedkar actually asked. And in some ways, rereading these texts and rethinking these questions is the task of our time.
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, can you please say where can I get articles especially on slave mothers?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. And so Horton Stillers, again, I cited her article on Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And one of the reasons that title, what it generates, is the condition of the female enslaved person. So I would recommend her article, which is easily accessible on Google, as Horton Spillers, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And part of what she shows in that article is what Orlando Patterson highlights as one of the constitutive factors of what distinguishes slavery. Now, we know slavery and colonialism were connected, but they're not necessarily the same modes, right? They are both world-shaping modes, and they intersected, especially in the Caribbean. But one of the constitutive factors of what is chattel slavery in the United States, which is also not the same of thinking about Roman slavery, for instance, in antiquity, is the separation of the mother from the child, which is called natal alienation. That's why Saidiya Hartman's second book is called Losing Your Mother. It's half memoir, half feminist theory. And the fact is, under chattel slavery, the woman whose the paternity of the child was often not known. It's we know, for instance, Thomas Jefferson, who was the writer of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, was himself in a long-term relationship with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, and they had many children together. Now, so Jefferson himself was a slave owner, but many of these children, some of whom were acknowledged paternity, many did not have acknowledged paternity, and the father was unknown. And so this complicates the question of race and reproductive economies, which is why Horton Spiller has that title, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And second, this idea of natal alienation, which is that the child that was born enslaved was not considered the mother's child, the slave mother's child, but was considered the master's property. So in that sense, natal alienation is the separation of the child, often at birth or at a very young age, from the family and put into servitude and slavery. And so that's a very important body of scholarship to look at for your interest in the slave mother. And it complicates our own accounts of reproduction in the colonial context.
Okay, the next one is, what is the difference between post-colonial feminism and African feminism?
Well, that is a big question, right? And one for study, I think. I think Black American feminism, too, has a specific place in a larger body of what you can call African feminism. And I am more read on the African American Black feminism. But there have been dialogues with, for instance, Angela Davis and larger Black feminism, both in Europe, right? One of the really moving points of intersection, I don't know how many of you followed the protests, but you saw there were mass mobilizations in the UK, right? In Britain, over George Floyd's, the brutality that happened in George Floyd's torture. And what happened, there were colonial statues, such as Clive, that were overturned and that were thrown over, these monuments, these colonial monuments, in the UK, in Bristol, for instance, in various parts of Europe. So then we see a Black consciousness, what Stephen Biko would think of as Black consciousness. And so there have been a lot of interchanges also in Latin America, with a larger Black feminist notion of Black feminism. I must say that I am more versed on what are the debates here in the United States. And one of them is, I think, to really acknowledge the particularity of what how our own accounts of subjectivity and female subjectivity are challenged by not just the historical account of what happened to the Black under Black modes of subjugation that were enacted, predicated on anti-Blackness, but really what are the philosophical contributions also of Black feminist movers?
Okay, ma'am. The next one is, do you find any similarity between the American situations and what are happening in India, especially with the Dalits, minorities, and so-called powerless?
I mean, I'm very Bengali, and I'm very have my heart there still, but I'm not an expert, and you will be able to tell me more of what is happening. I must say that I am not afraid, and I am very concerned, having heard from fellow academics and intellectuals in India about the rise of what I see as an alliance between Trump and Hindu fundamentalism, and Modi, and what I see as a very turn to autocracy, which endangers the very promise of a secular democracy, which is so fundamental to the constitution of what were the Afro-Asian mobilizations for. They were for a certain form of a non-autocratic rule. So, and the minority question, as you will know through the writings, do you read Hannah Arendt in India? Origins of Totalitarianism?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, so you know that Arendt, in her Origins of Totalitarianism, has a chapter on imperialism, a very intense chapter on imperialism and its relationship to race thinking. So I absolutely do think that we as intellectuals have an obligation to speak out. I mean, that is part of feminism when we see rising autocracy. And that is, it is very much a concern here. I mean, it is not even a hidden, a marginal discussion. It's in the New York Times. Headlines like, "We are living under fascism." There's a real concern over not having elections, over the vilification of minorities. And as we know through Arendt's writings, those are, when you have the discrimination against the Dalits and Muslim minorities, and as a state rhetoric, as a campaign rhetoric, then you know that there is, if we look through the works of Arendt on her own writings on fascism, then we know that there is an autocratic drive, that that this is part of what sediments modes of autocracy. And here we have seen a lot of erosion of our rights. We have seen a lot of erosion of many things that were put into protocol to protect people. And I don't think it's unrelated, the rise of global autocracy, also in Brazil. Brazil is India, Brazil, and the US now have the leading coronavirus cases that were mismanaged. Why? Because there's an autocratic impulse, and that it's not unrelated. I mean, autocracy is about a general neglect of the care for life.
Okay, ma'am. There's a very interesting question. Dalits has become a prey to caste discrimination, but we did not find any Dalits' lives matter. As we found in US, what may be the reason behind such silence?
Well, maybe you can teach me here. I mean, I keep up with, feminist scholars who are very engaged and involved with the anti-Dalit discrimination movements, and that being a part of postcolonial feminism. But I have some cultural understanding, right, of the way in which caste gets inscribed into the private sphere, right? This is part of feminism, from Arendt to Saidiya Hartman to Judith Butler to Gayatri Spivak. This is that the private sphere, right, is not separate from the public sphere. The private sphere is not within the domain of outside of politics. The private sphere is also a political sphere. Arendt would make this claim many times in her book, The Human Condition. And as a result, and also look at the question of natality. And as a result, this attention to the private sphere has been very fundamental to feminist theory. So one of the ways in which the silence happens I think around caste, and anti-Dalit sentiment is in the private sphere, is in the domestic relations of the private sphere. And that was true very much so under enslavement as well.
Okay, ma'am. And next, and perhaps the last one, it was asked by Pooja Das. In Biswas, an independent woman, she said about the ways how a woman can struggle and win. Does the same thing being applied in the lives of black women, where the white man is in other side?
Okay, I'm not fully understanding the question, but I think the question is about Black female subjectivity, or
the question is a comparison between Simone de Beauvoir's idea of independent women and how this idea has been incorporated into the lives of black women.
Okay, so I think that part of what the critique is, and there's a lot of critique of this, is that is Beauvoir's. I mean, Beauvoir's writings are complicated, right? Second sex and other things, but that idea, and we see this in the 19th century novel, right? The classic critique of Jane Eyre. How many women are in Jane Eyre, the novel, and who is the protagonist, right? It's the British colonial woman, and we've seen this in both Gayatri Spivak's reading of Jane Eyre, and where is Bertha? Bertha is in the attic, right? Bertha, who is a mixed race, Caribbean descent, colonial woman, is in the attic. This has prompted Jean Rhys's book White Sargasso Sea, and so we see this idea of the trajectory and the appeal for independent, women's rights, for instance, predicated on a white liberal subject, not necessarily just white, but a white liberal subject of notion of rights. That can often collude with racism and colonialism. And we find this, for instance, in feminist organizations here in the United States, which have sometimes legitimated wars of U.S. aggression in Asia, in the Middle East, based on that, the premise that women are not free in Asia or in the Middle East, right? So there's a contradiction in women's rights, this notion of women's rights, white women's rights, as freeing and liberating subjects. So I think that when we turn to Black feminism, a whole new set of questions emerge that are not derivative of that genealogy of independent women in Beauvoir. Beauvoir is almost of no consequence in Black feminism. And so instead, we have to look at this idea of not being owned, never being owned.
Okay, ma'am. And the last one for today, Dark Lady of Shakespeare and Black feminism both are same characteristically. That is a question mark. There is a question mark that Dark Lady of Shakespeare and the Black feminism both are same.
I would say no, that would be a very big generalization. And the point of reading, right, as a whole body of scholarship, what I've tried to put forth as the importance of listening to Black feminism in postcolonial studies. The whole point of reading is to engage with the details of the epistemic questions. So when we read Shakespeare for race, right, there are a lot of racialized figures in Shakespeare, mixed race, Black figures. Certainly that is an important protocol of reading. And certainly that form of literary reading is important. But how do we connect Black feminism to readings of Blackness, for instance, in Shakespeare? I don't know, maybe it's Freud. because Freud certainly relied on Shakespeare for certain motifs to make certain claims about the nuclear family, about questions of power, death, drive, sexuality. But other than that, I would say that it's not the same. That there are particularities and richness involved in Black feminist scholarship that is, and I think the protests, right? Again, 15 million people to 26 million people marched here. So they say these are the largest protests ever in US history. So these protests are putting forth a moral demand, right? For reckoning with the legacy of anti-Blackness in the constitution of modernity itself.
Okay, ma'am. With this question, we just call it a day. And on behalf of our college, on behalf of our department, I thank you cordially. Well, I cordially thank you for coming and delivering a lecture at so early hour a day. And thank you very much. And
thank you.
okay,
thank you for the invitation. Thank you. And again, if people want reading sources, I will send you a list of bibliography.
Okay, ma'am. If you can send me, then I will certainly distribute among them. Okay, ma'am.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for organizing.
Okay,
Pleasure
okay.
to
Thank
meet
you. Thank you, ma'am. And now, before giving the mic to Dr. Probir Kumar Datto, our IQAC coordinator, I must thank the people who are associated with this webinar. So I thank our respected TIC ma'am, Dr. Sujata Mukherjee, for her consent to organize the webinar. Without her consent, it would really impossible task for me to do. And I also thank Probir Da, the IQAC coordinator, without whose coordination and support, I cannot organize it. Apart from that, I also thank all the speakers, especially Amit sir, without whose help and support I failed to organize the webinar in such a way. And I also thank Srikanto Bosak, the technical expert, who is handling everything from the background, and more or less is like a nightingale. And at last, but not the least, I also thankful to my departmental colleagues, Topon Mondol, Fajle Noor, Jahir Rayhan, and Hasibul Rahman. Actually, all of them, we are working together to make it a grand success. And we also organize a sequel of this international webinar where participants can present paper. Actually, a lot of my friends, colleagues, even junior brothers and sisters are asking me that if there is any possibility to present a paper or not. So we have just planned that we would organize a webinar with the same title, and some of the resource person from this webinar may be there in the technical chair, and we will organize that. In that webinar, the participants, that means the students, scholars, and faculty members can present their paper, and after that we are also thinking to publish it in an ISBN book, and it will be told later by our coordinator Probir Kumar Datto. So I now hand the mic to her, and I also request you that to keep a patient a bit. After the valediction speech, the feedback link will be shared to you in the chat box, YouTube chat box. So please keep your patience, and Probir Da, it's to you. Please begin the lecture, begin the speech.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Actually, because of some unavoidable reason, our honorable teacher in church has to leave this meeting. So, with his due permissions, I am to propose the vote of thanks on these occasions, and it is also my privilege. So, with this lecture, we came to the end of the 3-day international webinar. I hope all of you have enjoyed the webinar, and this webinar has fulfilled your quest for knowledge, and those who attended it gained some new knowledge. Honestly speaking, the overwhelming response of the scholars, faculty members from all over the world was a great achievement for us. More than 3,200 candidates have registered for this webinar. I thank all of them because without their participation, this webinar will be of no use. And as Bhaskar shared with you, we will organize the sequel of this international webinars with due permissions from the teacher in church. In the next part, for the scholars, in that webinar, Only the scholar, research and faculty members will present paper virtually. Those who are interested to present papers are requested to contact the organizers, and it will be tentatively scheduled in the last week of August or first week of September. So with this, I thank you all, and stay home, stay safe. Thank you. Now over to Bhaskar. Now,
Okay, thank you, Pavitra. And now we are sharing the feedback link, and after filling up the feedback link, it can be expected that the certificates will go to their respective mails. Okay, just wait a bit, and we are just putting this in the chat box. Feedback form link. Do enjoy. Stay happy, and those who are interested to present paper, please contact with our organizing committee. That means you can contact me, or even Provida, or even the mail that even you can reply to the same mail from where the detailed schedule of the webinar has been sent. Okay. Here goes the link. I have just posted the link. Feel free, and just do not do it in hurry. Take time, and the link will remain open for a couple of weeks. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for enjoying the webinar. Thank you. We are just calling it a day, and we are finishing our 3-day international webinar. Thank you very much.